This is Ground Affected. My name is Brent, and welcome to a clogged airbrush. Not that my airbrush is clogged, but maybe yours is. Or maybe you just don't have one of these. And if that's the case, then I'm gonna show you how to use one of these instead. In this video, I'm gonna show you how I painted these skin tones using just a brush. But before we get into all that, I'd like you to click subscribe, perhaps click the like button. And if I haven't earned that by the end of the video, there's instructions for what to do in that instance. In fact, if you make it all the way to the end of the video, perhaps leave your thoughts and comments in the section below. Also, you may or may not know, I have a Patreon, which gives you access to a private Discord, and that's about it. And now, let's get straight into how to paint skin tones without using an airbrush. So, a few people have asked me previously on videos as well as posts on Facebook and Instagram if I can do a video showing how to paint with just the brush, no airbrush at all. And while sometimes I feel like this may be a poke at the proverbial bear, meaning I think sometimes people just believe that airbrush is cheating, when in fact airbrush is actually not cheating, it's just faster and easier. As you can see, for an example, the base coat alone, just starting out with this portrait, it took around 3 coats and around roughly half an hour to 40 minutes just to put the base coat down. This means I had to put one layer down, stand up and dry it, put another layer down, stand up and dry it, and really at the end of the day I could have sprayed that in one coat with the airbrush, dried that off and been ready to roll within 5 minutes. Is this cheating? I don't think this is cheating. I think this is making your life easier, and at the end of the day, there's no need to make things more difficult than they need to be. And now that we're past the base layers, I'm gonna start laying down colors onto this portrait that may or may not make sense. The first thing I'm gonna do is start to map out some sort of lighting pattern on the skin. So essentially, skin tones is made up of many different colors. We need yellows, we need pinks, we need whites, we need blues, we need greens even. So the way that I'm going to make this work is by not making my base layer too thick. First of all, that's going to create a little bit of the green underneath the undertones, and then I'm going to slowly start working my way up through essentially what is the tones or the hue range of the color set from Vallejo Fairy Flesh set. And basically all I'm going to do is making sure that my paint is super thin. I'm slowly going to start picking out highlights, essentially choosing a space from where the light is going to be coming from and making that the lightest part of the portrait. I pay careful attention to things like the high cheekbones and the forehead area, which is usually one of the areas that has a lot of reflected light coming off of it. So this, in essence, would probably be closer to white, as the light that's hitting the model is going to probably be a whiter light, something like from the sun. Now I'm starting to get into glazing phases. So once I've mapped out essentially the light pattern, I'm going to use much thinner paints and I'm going to go over the entire portrait again, and this is to blend everything together. So as you'll notice that from the first steps to now, it seemed very patchy and very blocky in a way, and you'll see I'll build it up to blocky again and I'll slowly break that down and soften it off again. This is just my way of slowly building up, almost in a careful way. If I did this too fast, I may go too far and have to start again or go back and paint shadows in, and I much prefer painting highlights in compared to shadows, because sometimes the shadows are in deeper areas that are more difficult to get to. Now for one of the most important things is bringing the life back into skin. I find skin tones to be a little bit desaturated, especially if you buy them in a set. So my way of bringing back the saturation to the skin is by using my secret weapon, which is Grimoire Purple, and I thin this down quite a lot, and I also mix this into the other colors that I'm using. This purple adds the life underneath the skin. Skin has got blood that runs through it, so we need it to look like there is blood running underneath the surface of the skin. And in order for me to emulate that, I use the purple, which is what gives that sort of life and helps bring back some saturation into the colors that I find already are quite desaturated. Slowly working my way up, I'm going to make sure that I work on the highest points, working on the eyelids, working on cheekbones, working on the forehead, the chin, areas around the mouth and the ears. These are the important things. One other important thing to work on is also the neck. The neck has a lot of light hitting it. Even though in your mind it looks like it would be in shadow, essentially you could create the illusion that it's in shadow, but I prefer to highlight the neck just to give a bit more volume to the entire portrait. And as you can see, I'm slowly working my way up to where I think the light would hit this model. Say the light was coming from the front, you can make this look more like a direct light or more like a soft light. A softer light would end up going more around the edges of the portrait and around the sides of the face, whereas a harder pin sort of light, perhaps like a spotlight, may only illuminate certain areas of the face. In this case, I've gone for a more spotlight kind of effect where I'm only going to highlight the very highest points on the face. This is to create a slightly more dramatic look to the piece once it's on the shelf. And this is one of the areas where brushes can actually help you to pinpoint these highlights a lot easier than an airbrush, whereas the airbrush will look softer just naturally, and the brush will have a harder look to it compared to the airbrush. Another thing about skin tones is that they need many layers. So I'm going to go back in again. This time I'm going to use a bit of yellow. This is going to bring some of the yellow tones to the skin, as well as help me to blend between layers and make the transition a lot smoother between the layers. Also, skin tones do tend to have quite a bit of yellow in them, as well as many colors to be fair, but I find that for my process of making skins, I use a lot of yellows, a lot of purples, and the fairy flesh set, which essentially I could mix that up from primary colors, but at the end of the day, I don't really want to waste a load of colors when I know that I can just take out the exact colors that I'm going to use and mix them further from there on the palette. I will change sometimes the way that I mix them, obviously depending on the person. Certain skin tones are lighter, certain skin tones are darker, so I'm going to change that as I work with it. And this is why I like having a set dedicated to doing my skin tones, because I know what they're going to behave like in a specific order, and I know how to change and adjust them with ease and without wasting too much paint on just mixing up a color. I think sometimes people just get too hung up on being able to mix paints rather than just using what is available to you. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Your final outcome is all that really matters. So in order to complete this entire portrait, I'm going to paint his hair. I just base coated that with a black, and essentially for his eyebrows, I'm going to use the black. I'll mix it a bit with a darker brown, just so that it's not pitch black, because that obviously would look a bit awkward. For painting his eyes, I do my usual where I use black on the inside of the socket. However, for this one, I used more of the darker brown just to try and not make it too black and stark. Another glaze going over the top again to smooth things out, as well as going back into the highlights with almost a white ivory kind of color. Working on the eyes, I'm going to place that ivory color that I use for highlights as the whites on the inside of the eye. To make this easier on myself, I use Airbrush Medium to thin the paints down a little bit and help them to flow a lot easier. Also bearing in mind, if it flows easier, it's easier for you to drip some paint in a place you didn't want to, so be careful not to overload your brush. I'm going to carry on working on highlights as I go along. I'm slowly going to build these up over time. Every time I paint a new layer, this is just adding to the effect of the skin. Yes, my paint style is not hyper realistic. However, I do have a very graphic comic style, and this is something that I work on myself, because I feel like as an artist, you want to have your own style stand out and look different from others. You don't want everything to look the same. Also, painting hyperrealism is extremely friggin' hard. So I'm just happy with my level, and the style in which I've chosen to paint is something that will hopefully show and shine through every time I paint a model. I'd like somebody to say, yes, that looks like it was painted by ground effected. Same thing with the eyes. I had to do quite a few layers of the white to get it to cover, obviously. I also used a little bit of the purple, and I painted that into the corners of the eye on the right and left hand side of the corners, just to try and get a little bit more depth in the eye. Painting his eyes, I started off with a brown base coat. Kind of weird, but I used brown as the base coat because I wanted a dark outer ring to the iris of his eye. Again, you can see me putting layers upon layers upon layers of glazes. Glazing is your best friend if you're going to paint something like this. Highlighting the hair with browns, I added a bit of the skin tone to the brown to create some continuity between the colors and the tone of the colors on the palette. And I'm only really going to place this to sort of the high spots again. Using a contrast paint, I'm going to use that just to paint off his lips and some of the deeper recesses, perhaps more like the wrinkles and such on his face, specifically in the ears and around his mouth and just around the hairline. I used that green that I poured out to paint the rest of the iris of the eye, and I allowed that to dry. Placed a black dot in the center and a white highlight for the shine, and that is the end result. And so I hope that made you realize that you don't need an airbrush just to be able to paint statues or models that you've 3D printed. Yes, using an airbrush can be so much faster. However, just because you don't have one of these and you only have a paintbrush, it doesn't mean that you still can't produce high quality results using just this. And so I hope that encourages more people to use a paintbrush in the future. But for real, I really hope that this has inspired more people to use their paintbrush and to not think inside the box that you can only do it because you have an airbrush or specific tools, the only way you can do certain things. There are other ways of doing things within this hobby that I think people should explore a lot more. Also, I'm not really sure why I'm speaking in Italian right now, and so I'll just stop that immediately. But if you found this video to be helpful or insightful in any way, make sure to share it with one of your friends or someone who is also interested in the same hobby as we are. And while we're speaking about people who enjoy the hobby, I'd like to thank the new patrons we got this week, Genesis and Lacey Mason. Thank you dudes so much for joining and subscribing to my Patreon. Your support means so much to me and helps grow this channel in ways I can't even imagine myself. As well as this helps keep these bloody lights burning the retinas of my eyes. If you've managed to make it this far into this video or any of my videos and you didn't like it, tough. YouTube took away the dislike count. However, you can still click the dislike button and just f off. I wonder if they're ever gonna get tired of me telling them to f off.